Welcome to the Trails Around the World podcast. Each episode inspires you with a new idea for a long-distance trail or an adventure, someplace interesting in the world that you can discover. We tell you why you want to go and tell you how to make the dream a reality. Hello, Amy and James. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Trails Around the World podcast. Today we're going to discuss the Tokai Shizen Hodou, which is in English, the Tokai Nature Trail, and runs from Kansai to Kanto. And for those of you who are less familiar with Japan, that's from the area around Osaka up to Tokyo. The word Tokai to Japanese implies this very famous, well-known high traffic area. And before the Meiji Restoration, this path was walked. But the Tokai Shizen Hodou is not the path that was famously walked along the Tokai area. A lot of the area that was traditionally walked, or the routes that were traditionally walked, are now highways and roads. And so the Tokai Nature Trail goes through the hills and is a much more pleasant place to be walking, and is a little more into the mountains than the traditional route would have been. I live in Japan right now, and Amy and James had visited before, but came and did this as foreigners visiting Japan. And I wanted to interview people who had done this, who came from outside, because I want that perspective of someone who is not as familiar with Japanese language and society. If you're thinking of visiting Japan, I think that the highest barrier is the language barrier. And that should not worry you. The signs are difficult to read. Many of them are in English, however, and people will help. And so the big thing in Japan is to realize that it's okay to ask for help. And even if you don't speak the language, you can still ask for help, and you can make it clear what you mean. And you will feel like you are playing charades sometimes, but you can, as we're about to illustrate, walk from one side of the country to the other and maneuver and survive perfectly well here without having the language and without being able to read many of the signs. Now, many people, when they visit Japan, have a typical sort of itinerary of going to Tokyo and Kyoto, maybe Nara, and maybe Kamakura or Nikko. And I've always told people that if they want to visit Japan, they should try to get away from those heavily touristed areas, because while those are wonderful places to see, if you can find time to break away from them and visit, say, Hiroshima, or even more the countryside, where really traditional Japanese culture is alive and well, although it is everywhere, but you can see it and feel it much more when you're in the countryside. And you should try to do that if you're visiting Japan. Now, this trail was started in 1969, completed in 1974. It was conceived and executed by the national government, but it was actually built and is maintained by the prefectures, which are similar to American states, through which it passes. So it's very different from trails trails in general in Japan are very different from the trails in the United States, in the sense that in the US, most trails, or many trails, are maintained by volunteers and by volunteer organizations in the United States. In Japan, almost all trails are maintained by the government, which has advantages and disadvantages, but it is different. I have been living here for over a year. I tried starting section hiking the Tokai Shizen Hodou from the Tokyo area in late 2019, and had to give up because there was what one would call a 100-year storm in October 2019, actually almost exactly a year before this is being recorded. In fact, I think it is to the day, a year before this was recorded. Thousands of people lost their homes. A number of people died. I was here during that storm. It was something I'll never forget. It was an absolutely incredible experience. You did not go outside. You couldn't. Everything was locked down and you were just trying to stay safe. I asked Amy and James to do this because I wanted their perspective, not only as people who've done the trail, but as people who came in from outside, as I said before. The other thing to know about this, and I think we'll touch on this later again, is that this is a great shoulder season hike. In the summer in Japan, you would probably decide it was too hot to do this. It's hot and humid. Think Washington, D.C., perhaps Washington, D.C. on steroids in terms of weather. It's a little colder in the winter, a little warmer in the summer, a little more humid in the summer. If you're not familiar with Washington, D.C., well, okay. But you probably have an idea if you are American. And in the winter, it does get cold. And since this goes through mountains, it'll have snow on it. And through hiking this particular hike, it's not one where you think of being challenged by snow. It's not necessary. So with that, Amy and James, in 1 to 3 sentences, could you tell us why we would want to experience this trail and what makes it special?
Okay, if we're talking about specifically about this particular trail, you have to put it in the context of our walk, in that we were interested in walking in Japan. And so our first goal was to find a long distance through hike in Japan. And through our research process, we ended up with the Tokai almost by default, because we could not find enough information in English or information even in Japanese with the help of a Japanese friend we had, who we asked him to do a little internet research in Japan, to actually put together a long distance through hike on what is supposed to be a very extensive system of trails in Japan. There are supposedly thousands of kilometers of named trails throughout all 4 main islands. But when you start to look into it, a lot of those trails may only exist as lines on the map. And in some cases, many of those trails exist as lines on the map, but they're actually just following roads. And those kinds of situations didn't appeal to us. And we stumbled upon information about the Tokai and read about it and said, this is what we're looking for. This is going to give us an opportunity to do a long distance through hike in Japan that is mostly on trail. A reasonable percentage is not in built up areas and has a defined starting point and ending point. And we have a reasonably good GPX track as a starting point to start doing our research. So we were selected the trail, as I say, almost by default. And we were quite pleased with the end results. It's a great trail. It stands up there with other world-class through hikes. And so there wasn't any downside to have ended up on this trail.
So that was a little bit of history of how we've ended up on the Tokai in particular. What I think makes it a great trail and why we really encourage other people to hike it is 2 parts. One is it's very well maintained and the logistics are easy in terms of getting to and from the trail. So although the trail has a lot of up and down and it's in steep mountains and the walking is not an easy walk in the park, the logistics are very easy. Getting food is easy and staying on. The more important reason that we recommend it is Japan is just not like any other place in the world where we've traveled. It's such a unique culture. And by walking on the trail, we were out experiencing real Japan, not tourist Japan, in a way that we couldn't if we had tried to go to regular tourist sites. The wonder of having a line to walk is we had no idea where it was going to take us or what we would see. And we didn't have to make any decisions about what we should do today. It was just, we had a line and we walked the line and got to experience everything that came along that line. We loved it and we highly recommend it.
Yes, walking through hike is following a line that somebody else has created. You can, of course, you can divert from the line, but in our case, diverting would just be a completely random choice. So why not say, okay, somebody's made a selection of this and said, this is the best place to go.
Mm-hmm.
So just take their advice and follow it.
So you mentioned that, and I wholeheartedly agree, it's a wonderful way of accessing the real deep Japan and the real culture. So that cultural side of it is a big part of the reason to walk it. How would you describe the terrain and scenery?
If you want to compare the trail to scenic trails that are around the world, several of which we've walked, it's not the world's greatest trail. The scenery is pleasant. It's relatively interesting, but it also is a little bit repetitive. It's in relatively low mountains that are mostly forested. The vast majority of the forests are third planting or fourth planting. They've been logged and harvested for millennia. So you're not walking through a primeval old growth forest. You're not in high, jagged alpine peaks like you'd be in the Sierra or you'd be in the Alps or other places where there's real big mountains. You are often descend down to the coastal plain, which is settled, and everything has been touched by humans, often again for millennia. So you don't go because it's a great scenery. Is it unpleasant scenery? No. We enjoyed being there. We enjoyed walking through the woods. We enjoyed looking at the birds. We enjoyed looking at the trees. But for us, the most important thing and the reason we came home saying, wow, this was a really fabulous hike, was just being in a place where there are so many cultural differences and they touch every aspect of what you do every day that it's just fascinating. It just makes it fun because you never know exactly what you're going to run into. It's the way things are done in Japan is just different than the way that they're done in the Western world. And if you open yourself up to that and say, hey, this is going to be interesting, it's really, really fun. And so that kind of joy of the unexpected is so rich on doing a trail like this and means so much for the overall coming home and saying, wow, well, I really love that trail.
In terms of the terrain for what the hiking is like, you referred to the storm last year. And until you've been in those steep mountains, it's hard to appreciate the landslip potential and the impact of a big storm. The mountains are steep. There were literally tens of thousands of steps, constructed steps made out of metal or wood or stone. So it's a lot of up and down. It's not leisurely walking on flat terrain, but the trail is maintained. So it's not dealing with blowdowns, or in the places where there had been landslips, they'd all been rerouted and there were detour signs around places where the trail had washed out. So well-maintained trail, but not necessarily easy walking.
It's remarkably steep, actually. There are sections where there are literally 3,000 or 4,000 steps that have been installed to take you up the side of a hill. And it was impressive to us how much work that the prefectures had put into making this possible. And the reality of it is, you wouldn't be able to do this trail just as a cross-country trip.
No.
The terrain is not only being steep, it's really a lot of unconsolidated sediments. And you try to walk off trail and it's a lot of work. So it's not like going to the Sierra Nevada where if there's no trail, you just go cross country and it's just a joy. Here, boy, if there was a piece of trail missing, you'd notice.
Yeah. I often say to people that Japan has the steepest mountains in the world. And it's because geologically they're new. It also has the most earthquakes of any country in the world. If you go to the USGS website, you will look at different countries around. They have a map and it shows all the recent earthquakes. And Japan has multiples of any other country, including the west coast of the US, in terms of earthquakes. And it's a constant thing here. So one develops an entirely different attitude towards it. That's also why there are these geothermal hot springs that are in many places and that the trail passes by. And we'll probably mention those again. So if you could introduce yourselves, Amy, James, tell us a little bit about your background. And I use the term adventure resume, what you've done that got you here in terms of being able to take these sorts of adventures.
Well, I'm in my 60s and James is in his 70s. I started hiking and camping in my first summer, so I was 6 months old. And I've been hiking and camping ever since. It's really been the sort of the core, most important part of my. For James, he started as a teenager. We think of ourselves primarily as hikers. And in addition to a lot of hiking, and I'll talk a little bit about what kind of hiking we do, we've done 1 long canoe trip and 3 bike trips, but mostly we're hikers. So in terms of hiking, we have 3 different types of hikes that we do. We live in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is just has a wealth of public land and great hiking. So we do a lot of day hiking and short overnight hiking close to home. We do a lot of wilderness backpack trips in the US, primarily in the Sierras in southern Utah, but other parts of the US. And those are, week to 10-day backcountry trips, often off trail. And then in 2002, we took our first overseas long distance hike. And we've done, 15 or 20 overseas hikes. So those are really 3 categories of hikes that we've been doing. Did I miss anything, Jim?
Well, yeah, there's a little bit of difference. In the second category, she talked about taking week to 10-day backpacking trips in the US. And those are wilderness trips where you are carrying everything you need. You're completely self-supported. Mm-hmm. Once you start the trip, you don't get anything else until you've finished. So if you don't have it, you don't have it. And those are in the United States is blessed still with some reasonably wild lands, and the places we tend to go, it's quite wild. And those are true wilderness experiences. On the long distance hikes that we've done in overseas, and in some of the long distance hikes we've done in the US, really longer distance ones in the US, those are a mix where you, as in any long distance hike, you have to resupply. That you cannot possibly carry 4 weeks worth of food or 6 weeks worth of food. And you wouldn't want to, even if you physically could. It's silly. So these trips are organized so you are passing through areas with other people. You're getting out of the wilderness. Or in the case of Europe, there is essentially no wilderness left there. You're going into places that are scenically beautiful. The Alps are quite beautiful, but they're also full of roads and ski lifts and other teleferiques and all sorts of built up stuff that is there for people to enjoy the mountains in a different way than we do in our country. So in those trips, you just don't plan on saying, oh, this is going to be a wilderness experience. It's a different experience. It's not worse or better, it's different. And so when we decided to go to Japan, we knew very well that we would be passing through villages, sometimes every day. And that's fine. That's part of the fun. And that's part of the fun of walking in England or in France or in Turkey or some other place, is that you actually are walking through a living landscape. And in the case of Japan, in the case of Europe, these are landscapes that have been inhabited and been affected by a culture that has been there for millennia. So the changes that you're seeing weren't instituted last week, or as a case of the United States, the landscapes that are changed here were all changed in the last couple hundred years. It's new. The landscapes in England, they started grazing sheep there 2,000 years ago. And so the changes that have occurred over an extremely long period of time. And so the landscapes, they kind of look what we would say natural, even though they're extraordinarily human affected. And the same thing is in Japan, that people have lived there and changed those landscapes for thousands of years.
So speaking to our trip on the Tokai Shizen Hodou, when we were looking at going hiking in Japan, we found a Facebook group, Hiking in Japan, and the people there gave advice about, well, this is the most scenic place. This is the place that has the most beautiful mountains. And we specifically weren't looking for scenery or most beautiful mountains. We were looking for a settled landscape where we could experience life in Japan, as opposed to trying to find great scenery. So, and the Tokai is perfect for that.
Yeah, if we want really, really great scenery, the Sierras are 4 hours away and are unmatched as a place to go backpacking for scenery.
I'll add something, and actually this applies to the previous question. I should say that Japan does have the dramatic scenery that you're talking about. And I read someplace once that if you actually do a breakdown on the land use around Japan, it's 93% unpopulated.
Mm-hmm.
So only 7% of the land is populated. And there are two mountain ranges which you can stitch together, or three mountain ranges which are called the Japan Alps.
Mm-hmm.
And they are very dramatic. They have trails all over them. They have mountain refuges through them where you can stay while you're hiking and get food, so you don't need to carry a tent or food while you're doing these dramatic alpine hikes. And that's not what we're talking about in this interview, but it is available in Japan. One thing that one should be very aware of is that it's only really accessible for approximately 2 months a year, from say July 10th to September 10th.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't want to do it outside of that time because of storms or snow, i.e. because of weather. And that is the period when it would probably be too hot to want to be doing this trail.
So for us, we are very happy that we chose a trail that was in a culturally rich corridor, as opposed to trying to pick something optimized for great scenery. It worked out perfect.
I have found hiking in the high Alps in Japan that, in a strange way, it was a marvelous way of accessing the culture, because the bond between hikers breaks down the cultural bonds. And for instance, there are group baths, and I've been invited into baths with the other men that were in the staying in the Yamagoya, which is the modesty issue is uncomfortable for some Americans, but you just have to let go of that. And when you see Japanese who are such hardworking people and normally societally have so little free time, this is a situation where these people are relaxing entirely, just like us when we go hiking. This is our greatest release, and it is for them too. Hiking is very, very popular in Japan. And so in the high Alps, there is that cultural access in terms of the fact that you're all hikers breaks down barriers, including the language barrier, not because you can speak to each other, but because you can still communicate somehow. And that's an upside to that. But this provides a different access, and this is much easier to section hike, for instance. We'll come back to that.
Unlike the experience that you just described, we met numerous day hikers, but we didn't meet any other backpackers we met one Japanese backpacker total in our entire hike. So our cultural experience was not with other hikers, it was with the people who live in the land. So the two different kinds of things would complement each other.
Yeah, I want to say that part of what you're talking about is a matter of what kind of style you enjoy in your walking, and that we've walked done several long distance walks in Europe and in the mountains there, where again, there's lots and lots of refuges, but we still choose to carry a tent. Nobody in Europe carries a tent, but we still choose to carry a tent. We don't really want to stay in refuges. We'd like to get a meal there. I mean, a refuge in Italy where you can go and get a dinner meal after you've walked all day, hey, that's great. But as soon as dinner's over, we'll go off and camp. And so having a culture that where the hiking culture is built around refuges is quite different than what we are looking for. And so having those refuges isn't necessarily a selling point for what we're looking for when we go out.
I should say, in comparison to Europe, where refuges cost maybe $35 to $50 per person per night, in Japan, the Yamagoyas cost $80 to $100 per person per night.
Mm-hmm.
And this is in the high Alps. And that's often reasonable in some ways because they helicopter a lot of the supplies in. And in many cases, to prevent or minimize environmental impact, they're also helicoptering the waste, all of the waste, solid waste as well, out. So you're paying for that. But it's really expensive, so you would not be alone. People who are the most intense Japanese hikers are also carrying a tent because they simply cannot afford to be up in the mountains paying $80 to $100 a night per person for as much time as they want to be. And
A lot of backpackers carrying tents in the Japanese Alps.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
You don't see that in Europe.
Yeah. And that's the reason it just costs so much. And they can still eat at the Yamagoyas. The Yamagoyas increase their income by serving those people meals without having to provide the shelter. Mm-hmm. And they often also provide the camping space outside and let them use the baths. So anyway, I didn't mean to get into the high Alps, but it is worth mentioning, I think, for people.
I think it helps put in perspective the different options that are available.
Yeah.
We were aware of the Japanese Alps before this trip, and I have a work colleague who had actually done some hiking up there, and we thought about it, but it didn't really, the kind of walks that we would do there in the time of year and that experience didn't really appeal for what we were looking for for a trip to Japan. As I say, if I want to go to the high Alps, I can drive to the Sierra.
Right.
And we wouldn't have gotten, I don't think, the more diverse cultural experience that we had by walking the lower trail. That we would have experienced the huts, and we would have experienced the kind of people who are Japanese backpackers and who go to huts and so forth. Whereas on this lower altitude route, we experienced a much bigger cross-section of what Japan's about.
Yes, absolutely. This trail passes through almost every aspect of Japan, except for islands, I think. And the other thing to remember is the access to this trail is absolutely, because of the incredible public transport system in Japan, is absolutely amazing. And you can get to any point on this trail that crosses a road or a town within half a day from either Osaka or Tokyo, mostly by train.
Boy, are we envious.
And you know, that is not at all the case with the high Alps. It takes an entire day to get up there often, regardless of how you go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the reasons that we chose to go here is that we knew it would be a different place that we had hiked before. And another reason was that in my case, I had traveled to Japan probably a dozen times previously on business throughout 20 or 30 years of business travel. And I had spent most of that time in Tokyo or up in the Sendai area. And I was sitting in international hotels. I was sitting in meeting rooms. I was sitting in factories. And I was being taken out to meals in nice restaurants by clients or customers on a regular basis. And so I saw one piece of Japan. The only non-business part of that was if I was there for more than a few days, if I had a day off, I would go out and wander in the nearest piece of green I could find because I'm a birder. And so I would just go out and see whatever birds we can find. Amy also traveled to Japan 2 or 3 times on business. And we happened to have trips that were scheduled for the same time period just by chance with our different companies. And so we decided that we would go up to Hokkaido on our own for a few days. It was February and we wanted to go see the cranes. So that was our first solo travels in Japan, where we rented a car and we figured out where we were going to stay and moseyed around and saw the cranes and had a great time. And it said to me that, hey, we can travel here without any problems. I don't need to have all the support that's provided when I'm on a business trip, where everything is organized and you don't have to make any decisions or figure anything out. So this worked just fine, no problem. And so neither of us felt intimidated by the thought of just going over there, not speaking Japanese at all, and not really knowing a lot about culture outside of business culture that we are going to encounter. So we felt very comfortable saying, okay, let's just go do this. It wasn't scary. It wasn't intimidating.
I should say about getting around in Japan that they don't really have discount tickets for the trains and such. You'd simply pay the fare. And so that's not something that one has to worry about as a foreigner. You're simply going to pay the fare and it's going to be charged honestly, and they're going to take the money, and that's that. And in the modern age, with Google Maps or various other software, another popular one is Navitime. And then for Navitime and Google Maps will both give you the trains, and then there's also Japan Transit Planner. And I'm looking at my phone, I have 3 or 4 of these things right on there. And if you don't speak the language, it's fine. You just need to make sure you have connectivity, and that's far easier than in the US. And you simply look these things up on the fly almost, or I actually do look them up on the fly, and it tells you exactly which train. It tells you which car to get on the train so that you'll be positioned to get off at the right stairwell when you arrive at your destination. So it's incredibly easy, even if you speak English. If you have an American smartphone or a smartphone from anywhere else, you can buy devices that will give you wireless, rent them at an airport and carry them and have wireless wherever you go in the country. And then since you have your home country, your home language smartphone, then Google Maps, for instance, will be in your own language rather than if you had a Japanese smartphone that had Google Maps in Japanese, and there are differences. So
one of my favorite anecdotes about that is that the system is so incredibly honest that we would sometimes buy tickets to the wrong station because it wasn't completely clear at the ticket machine to us which station we were buying the ticket for. And we would get there and we'd get off, and then a little bell would ring as we go through the turnstile, and one of the attendants would come out and hand us money back.
Yes.
So I mean, he would return,
the difference,
10 cents.
Yeah.
And it was just this feeling like this system is absolutely honest. No matter what you do, they're not going to cheat you.
Yeah.
Described how easy it is given smartphones now. I think it was 20 years ago, I was in Japan on business, and I stayed for an extra weekend with a colleague, and we went to the Miho Museum, which is out in the mountains. So it took 3 or 4 transit changes. And we just printed a page with from the Miho Museum,
yep,
that's where we wanted to go. And we went to a bus stop and we just showed it to them.
Yep.
And we just held out our hands with a bunch of money.
That's
And
it.
they, somebody said, oh, Miho Museum, and they got us to the right place and took some money and put
Yep.
us on a bus, and we got on the bus and showed it to the driver, and the driver took us to the next connection and put us
Yep.
on the next bus. And so very easy, very, very easy traveling.
And that will work perfectly here, and people will take care of you. So it really, that language barrier problem, while it's very much there, it's part of the adventure. That don't let it scare you away. Jump into it and proceed. Yes.
Japan is an excellent place to go if you haven't done a lot of travel and you're going to want to go to places where you don't speak the language.
Yeah.
Japan is a great training ground, because if you make a mistake, as you inevitably will, the consequences are so small.
Yeah.
And you can gain confidence in your ability to deal with these things.
Exactly. And it is at the same time a real excursion into a different culture. It's a very different place.
Yes.
It certainly is.
The underlying assumptions are different. So I had a sort of side question here, as someone in my 50s with arthritis starting to work its way into my hips and my feet starting to have their issues and my energy not what it was 20 or 30 years ago. James, what is your secret? You're in your 70s and you're still pushing out 20-mile days.
Well, I have my physical problems too. And I think it's just, I don't want to admit to myself that I'm not going to be able to do this. And I keep putting off the day in which I'm forced to admit to myself that I have to slow down. But just walking is the best way to stay fit for walking. And we just do it a lot. And you don't wear yourself out walking. We have a close friend who's an orthopedic physician. He says, you don't wear out your knees walking. He says, you may wear out your knees playing tennis, but you don't wear them out walking. So just keep at it.
Yeah, that's my hope.
Yep.
And one nice thing about walking is you don't have to walk long distances.
Yeah.
Right. So we get up very early in the morning. We walk all day at a pretty leisurely pace, but we go all day.
Yeah.
So we have a distance that's comfortable for us, but we could have done the Tokai in traveling half that distance each day. There's no requirement that it be at the pace we walk at.
And when we do a long distance walk, we always plan additional days more than we think it's going to take. So we don't feel pressure. It's like, oh, if we don't make 15 miles or 20 miles today, we're not going to make our plane, so we need to rush. Or if it's really a terrible day, we can't stop early. Or if there's great birds, we can stop and look at them. And when we finish the trip, then we go, and we usually have a few extra days, an extra week, and we just go and find someplace else local and poke around. And it just removes the stress of having to make a schedule.
And I think, sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, I wanted to clarify one thing, because we've been using the term long distance hikes, and for different people that means very different things. So for us, our optimal hike length is about 4 or 5 or 6 weeks. So we have never really been interested in the very long distance trails, partly because we like to go during the best season. And for a very long distance trail, you're compromised.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, on the Tokai, we picked what we thought was exactly the perfect season in terms of cherry blossoms and weather. So for us, long distance hikes are sort of 4 to 6 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And Tokai was perfect for that. It was just the right length.
Yeah. Well, that kind of moves us to our next question, which is, what about hiking makes you love doing it?
Well, at a most fundamental level, it's being outdoors. We both enjoyed just getting out of, in my case, in her case, it was where you were employed, and we were employed indoors. Our jobs were behind desks. And so the contrast in being outdoors is just a joyful thing. For me, doing walks like this, I'm kind of a goal-oriented person. And it's nice to be able to set a goal. I want to through hike this particular trail. I'm going to start at the beginning and I want to get to the end. And so I have a goal, and it's something that we're usually able to achieve, and that is satisfying. There's a sense of adventure in that each walk that we do has certain kinds of challenges, and these may not be difficult challenges, or some cases they are difficult challenges. And figuring out how to deal with different terrain and different kinds of weather, unexpected events that occur is interesting. I love seeing new places. I mean, Amy doesn't mind doing the same walk over and over again. For me, if it's a new trail, it's great because it's the bear went over the mountain to see what he could see. I love getting to the top of the mountain and looking over and seeing what's on the other side of that mountain and saying, oh, look on the horizon, there's another mountain. I better go over there and see what's on the other side of that. That is just really satisfying. I like physical activity, but I don't like physical activity in groups. I was never enjoyed team sports or those kinds of things. And this is just great physical activity that I can do with my partner and helps me stay fit. And then finally, as we mentioned, we're both very, very avid birders. And being outdoors, there's no matter where you go, there's always birds. And being able to watch and enjoy birds is one of the joys of hiking. And it's one of the things that we spend a lot of times on our walk doing. We always carry binoculars and we're always looking at the birds. And so going to a place like Japan is a great excuse to go see new birds, if nothing else. So part of being over there is we carried our bird guide and we were able to tick a lot of new species for our list and learn a lot of new birds and enjoy them and learn things about them. And you can do that anywhere you go around the world outdoors.
Mm-hmm.
You going to add anything?
Walking through a landscape is just the right pace where you get changes, but you see details. So the birds, butterflies, plants, as well as the big vistas, it's just the right pace to move through a landscape and see new places and take in new sights and sounds.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure I have anything else to add to what Jim said.
Well, there are a little bit more information specifically about the Tokai is that we stumbled upon a website from an Australian walker named Nomadic Tom.
Right.
And he described his experience on the Tokai, and he had a GPX file.
Mm-hmm.
He freely admitted that he went off route many, many times during his walk. And so his file wasn't actually a completely accurate rendition of the trail, but it was a good starting point. And I imported that into our various mapping programs. And using that, I was able to figure out, in many cases, where did he go off and where the trail might be. When I had that information, I later found a couple of other tracks from some Japanese walkers that had done pieces of the Tokai. And so I incorporated those also into my own planning. But we went over there basically with a GPX track of what we thought the route was, and no guidebook. We had one app that we used for Japanese topography that was helpful during the walk. It didn't show trails per se, but it showed where people had kept tracks. And so you got these sort of cloud trails on the maps, where if there were a lot more dots along here, you'd figure there's a lot of people walking there, so there's probably a trail underneath that. And we found that useful. But we were never able to, before the trip, find any actual paper maps of the route. We did find one prefectural map in, I think it was a nature center or something we stopped at along the way that was pretty useful. But prior to the trip, we didn't have it. So, but we figured with this GPX track, it's close enough. We'll be able to figure out exactly how it goes.
I think Jim described that in detail because it's the first named trail that we've hiked where we didn't actually know where the trail was supposed to be. We knew there was a trail and we knew where it started and ended. And we had Nomadic Tom's track, but he said he frequently lost it and ended up on roads. Given how much effort has been put into maintaining the track, every day we said, boy, if they just published a GPX file so people would know where this trail is, it could be a really popular trail. It's interesting.
Well, and so you did it yourselves.
We tried. We took a lot of notes and we tried to make sure that we documented where is the trail when it's very well waymarked. So when we were on the trail, there were Tokai trail tags. And so I think we were able to create a line that represents what's the actual trail.
And we kept careful notes when we obviously lost the trail, and that happened on a number of occasions. We kept notes of how we refound the trail and then went back and reconstructed after the fact where we think the actual trail is and included that in the GPX track that we've published of the route. So we think as of the date that we did it, and people need to understand that trails get moved over time. There's cultural changes that causes them to be rerouted. But after we completed the trail, we think our track is a reasonably good, accurate representation of the variation that we took. There are a couple of variations to this trail. There's one that heads all the way down to the coast and loops back. And we did not walk those variations. We walked what we believe to be the main stem.
I intended for the where do you find information on the trail to be later in the interview, but let's say that you have published online this incredible track that you put together. And as you say, you can't find it anywhere else. This is, as far as I know, the most complete and the only GPS track like this that's available for this trail. And it makes it accessible for others who are coming from overseas in a way that couldn't be done otherwise. And you give instructions for how to use it on your website, so there's no reason to do that. You have a blog at doingmiles.com. We'll mention that again at the end of the podcast. But that is the first place to look if someone is interested in doing this trail and is researching in English.
James already acknowledged Nomadic Tom, but I just want to reiterate, we would not have hiked this trail without his information because we wouldn't know. We knew there was a trail called the Tokai Shizen Hodou, but we had no idea where it was located.
Right.
So he got us started, and
right.
Then we made a real effort to create a resource that future hikers.
And I mean, I would say the same of you. I have started section hiking it, and I couldn't have done that without your trailblazing on this and putting that GPS file, GPX anyway, putting that file of waypoints out there. And you also include all the resupply points on there. So all the places where one can drop into a market or a 7-Eleven type place, a convenience store, and resupply. And that's an amazing resource to have. Of course, it will change over time as those open and close. Right now, of course, with the pandemic going on, a lot of konbini, in Japan, you call them konbinis, which is just from convenience store. A lot of konbinis are going out of business, just as other businesses are going out of business around the world. So that is to be kept in mind. There are maps in Japanese that are published by Shobunsha, Shobunsha, if you're trying to spell it in English. And those are the best hiking maps I've used anywhere in the world. These are topo maps that are printed on plastic, basically, and so they aren't vulnerable to wet weather, which is very important in Japan. And you can get those certainly for a good deal of the eastern end of this trail. I haven't tried to find them for the western end. I would imagine that they're available for some, but not all. There are also 3 books in Japanese that cover the entire trail. They were published in 2000. I have them. They're getting harder to find. And frankly, if you're coming from overseas, I don't think I would go to great effort to try to get them because they're in Japanese. They read like a normal Japanese book does, which is to say, in the English speaking mind, backwards. Um, they go from right to left rather than left to right. And a good deal of the writing, which is in Japanese, is vertical, not horizontal. So it's really traditional, real Japanese book kind of thing. And it's not simplified or dumbed down at all. And I will try to use them partly as an exercise in teaching myself the language, but I would not, I don't think I would bother, especially given their weight to carry if I were a person coming from overseas just to do this trail.
Yeah, in all honesty, there's very few trail guides that we've ever found that are truly worth carrying. Most
Yeah.
of them, one, they're out of date as soon as they're published, because that's saying, okay, this is the trail on this particular day, and that was 2 years before the book's published, because that was when the guy walked and wrote it. They also tend to have a lot more words in there that it's actually useful if all you're trying to do is follow a trail.
Yep.
And I think we found one or two that we liked on one or two excursions, but for the most part, if you can get a good map,
Mm-hmm.
now everything, of course, isn't available. Many things are available online. There's some good mapping applications, and you have a sense of how to navigate using a map, then that's really all you need.
I agree. What most of us tend to carry on trail is a map. And my preference is to have a paper map like Shobunsha plus a GPS with a track. And it's at that point almost impossible to get lost. And you can focus on enjoying the trail rather than spending too much time navigating. That said, you should be sure of your ability to navigate before you come out and do something like this.
Yes. We talked about, both for us and Nomadic Tom, losing the trail. And to be clear, it's not losing a trail, because there's a wide network of trails. So it's missing a turn. It's not like you're lost in the woods. You're on a trail, but you don't know if you're on the Tokai Shizen Hodou or some other trail.
One of the things that there are trail signs, and almost all of them are in kanji, and you can learn to recognize some of the characters and say, okay, that's the sign that says Tokai Shizen Hodou.
Right.
But we learned very late in the trip that many of those signs are, this is a spur trail to the Tokai Shizen Hodou, leading from the trail to the nearest bus station.
Yes.
And so you'd get to a junction and there'd be signs that both say Tokai Shizen Hodou,
Right.
going two different directions. And it wasn't until very late in the trip that we realized you don't take the one that's going to the bus station.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah. If you can read the word bus stop in Japanese, it helps.
Well,
yes,
I think
we learned eventually.
I think we finally were in a prefecture where they used a different colored arrow. So there would be two Tokai Shizen Hodou signs, and one would have an arrow in one color and another would have an arrow in another color.
Right.
And we did a little bit of Rosetta Stone detective work and figured out, okay, we know the trail goes that way, so that other color must mean something else.
Yeah.
Right.
A lot of the trail users are day hikers.
Mm-hmm.
And so they'll take to the nearest bus stop and they'll go walk a piece of trail from village A to village B, and then they'll want to get back to the bus stop.
Exactly.
And so the trail is set up to accommodate those people. And I'm sure it works very well if you read Japanese.
Yes. The three books are published by a company called Shichiken, Shichikaken. But as I said, as we're all saying, what you need is a map. So don't spend too much time on worrying about the books, I think, for most people coming to do this trail. The other thing is that just within the last year online, there is now a website called tokainature-trail.com, and a woman has published an ebook called Hiking the Tokai Nature Trail, a complete guide. And her name appears to be Catlin Herrera. And I haven't gotten too deeply into this ebook. She has it available online with space for donations. And she has, it seems, a medium level of Japanese ability and has been able to pull together a lot of the other sources we're talking about and draw from them and provide more information on this trail. She has hiked the trail from Tokyo to Aichi Prefecture, which is about halfway, or maybe a little bit more than half of, maybe about 60% of it. And then she got injured. So she stopped, and I assume that she'll try to get back to it after the pandemic. But what she's done is certainly something that we would all want to look at now. And so that's terrific. She also has her own opinion to add on how to deal with traveling in Japan, camping, resupplying, all of that. And that's worth reading. So much appreciation to her for doing that effort. And if anyone uses that resource, of course, hopefully she has a spot to make a donation on the website, and people can put a donation towards her to help defray the costs of putting this guide together. That is the end of part 1 of my interview with Amy and James about the Tokai Shizen Hodou. Please join me next time. In part 2, the continuation of the interview, Amy and James and I discussed many of the logistics and more details about hiking this trail. Until then, thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to the Trails Around the World podcast. Please visit us online at trailsaroundtheworld.com, and please join our Facebook group under the same name. If you liked this podcast, please help us out by leaving a review on your favorite podcast source, such as Apple Podcasts. This is Sky King, and I look forward to you joining us next time. In the meantime, happy trails to you, and please remember to leave no trace as you enjoy the outdoors.